This week, I've got The Long Walk, which is an adaptation of a Stephen King novel, and at the time, it was an allegory for the Vietnam War, and sadly, it is probably as relevant, if not more relevant today. It is about this dystopian America, so now, question mark, that's in a totalitarian regime, now, question mark, and they have this contest that is effectively kind of mandatory. It's a voluntold situation where the young men of the country have to lottery in, and there's one representative from each state, and every year they compete in this long walk where you have to walk at least 3 miles an hour, and if you don't, you die. This is in the trailers. That is it. There's no finish line, and it's just a last one standing. There can be only one. This is directed by Francis Lawrence, who did The Hunger Games, and adapted by J.T. Molnar, who did a film called Strange Darling, and, you know, the Francis Lawrence Hunger Games part of it very much makes sense because this is a really brutal R-rated Hunger Games in some senses, you know, spiritually similar. It's not exactly the same, but in terms of, you know, these young people having to compete in something that has been mandated by the government in a ridiculous and horrific way, yeah, it's very similar. I had no expectations going into this. You know, adaptations of Stephen King stuff go one of two ways. They are either not good or they are amazing. And I'm also not really a horror person. I wouldn't call this explicitly horror. I would call this psychological horror given the circumstances they're in. But I wasn't expecting a lot from this. I haven't read the book, so I can't speak to it as an adaptation in that sense. But I found myself riveted by this film. One, from just the horrors of watching it. But two, I think the performances are spectacular. So two of the main competitors or contestants are played by Cooper Hoffman and David Johnson, and David Johnson is going to win an Oscar someday. Not for this one, sadly, because the Academy doesn't love a hard R, but, you know, I think he is such a phenomenal actor. He was in Rye Lane, Alien Romulus, the show Industry, and he is absolutely something to watch. And then Cooper Hoffman, who is the son of Philip Seymour Hoffman, I was not sold on him per se. I know his big thing was Licorice Pizza, and that is a film I did not enjoy, and so I don't blame him for that, but I didn't enjoy that film as a whole. But seeing him in this, I'm like, oh, this kid can in fact act. And then I actually saw him at a film at TIFF, and I went, this kid is delightful and charming, so I consider myself a convert. It also stars Garrett Tutnya, Charlie Plummer, Ben Wong, Roman Griffin Davis, Judy Greer, and Mark Hamill is this character called the Major, who is the man who is in charge of running the whole thing, and he plays this psychotic military leader, and, you know, it's just Mark Hamill getting to scream and chew the scenery a little bit, which is, it's kind of always fun to see. But yeah, so this film, definitely a hard R, so just be aware of that if you are squeamish like I am. There are a few scenes in here that are going to make you pretty upset. It doesn't shy away from that. And I think in this case, it is actually in service of the story, you know, in terms of we are trying to demonstrate the horrific situation that these characters and you know, society has put everyone in, and it all makes sense within the context of it, but it is just something very hard to watch. Like I said, the performances are really something. The only other thing I would caution, aside from, you know, the horrific nature of it, is that if you are a hardcore fan of the book, I can't speak to how it is as an adaptation. I do know there are apparently some major changes that were made. Now, I think this version of it worked well, having no additional context for what the book is, but I, you know, can imagine if somebody is a very passionate fan of the source material that they would be potentially, I don't know, perturbed by the differences here, but I think this worked really well. You know, again, a painfully prescient core story, which the Stephen King capable of doing, and it makes sense that it took this long to adapt, / it's probably the right time for this to come out, which is such a bummer to say. But yeah, The Long Walk, like coming out of the film, I was really excited to discuss it with people, which is always a good sign because I think a lot of the times I get to, you know, I see so many movies that it's hard for something to stick with me. And so the fact that I've been thinking about this since I got to see a screening of it a while ago, I think is a positive indicator of the quality of this film. I'm going to give it a 4.6 out of 5. The next film I have is Downton Abbey, the grand finale, and I would assume based on the name that this is the last film in the Downton Abbey franchise, although you never know with something like this. I consider myself a pretty big Downton Abbey fan, you know, love the series. The movies I'm not so hot on, you know, I know academically I have seen the last film, but if you ask me to recall anything that happened in it, like explicitly recall it, I don't think I'd be able to do so. You know, it's just poof, gone from my brain. Now, do you really need to remember the last film in order for this one to make sense? No, absolutely not. Would you enjoy this film if you were not a fan of the franchise already? No, and I don't know why you'd see something called the grand finale if you were not familiar with the rest of the material, but, you know, to each their own. So in this one, we are once again back with the Grantham Crawley family and the servants and people who surround them. We are in the 1930s, and I think the big challenge for me with this film is that when the series was coming out, the world bleak, but maybe not as bleak as it is now. And at the time, it was a sense of escapism. Like, I didn't mind the fact that there are all these incredibly rich people and they might not be as relatable. And, there's this huge disparity between the wealth and living conditions of, the upstairs crew and the downstairs crew and, all this stuff. Like, I think I was more willing to dismiss it because things were just not as terrible right now. But watching this film in this time, like, my sense of sympathy or empathy for these characters being like, oh no, we have to sell one of our super expensive manors, but it's not like they're going to be homeless. Like, I had more trouble this time around relating to the arcs that they were going to. And I think some of that is just, the state of the world and maybe how I've evolved as a person since then. But I also think this film is a little bit out of touch, and, they tried to address it in this and trying to be progressive. The other challenge, I think, especially with the movies, through the course of the series, we got to see these characters go on a journey, reckon with the kind of more evening of the playing field, barely, of the statuses between themselves and, like, the servants and crew, etc. But it's hard to do that in the course of the movie, and I feel like these characters get stuck in time and don't go on character arcs. There's also so many characters to cram in, and I do feel like they knew this was going to be potentially, kind of hopefully, honestly, the end for them, so they're trying to make sure you see everybody before you go. But it's a lot to jam into effectively like a 2-hour movie, and I feel like characters don't get as much time as they deserve, or things just get delivered very expositionally, being like, oh, by the way, this person's doing this, and you're like, okay, farewell. So having it take place, I think it takes place in 1930, there's a lot of concerns about the financial stuff, which actually, I suppose, that is one of maybe the few things I remember from the last film, is that they're concerned and they're trying to modernize and all this other stuff in order to keep the estate and the area around it going. But there's just a cognitive dissonance about watching it at this point. And maybe it's just because of the prevalence of like billionaires and stuff like that, where I'm going, I don't feel the same way for these characters as I would have 5+ years ago. Like I said, it is absolutely a send-off. I enjoyed this one better than the last one, certainly. And I think at this point, I am ready to be done with these characters and say goodbye. It is a fitting farewell, and that is the most positive thing I can say about it. The actual story itself is kind of meandering, and, you're only invested because you have invested so much time into these plots and these people. But I think there's a lot of areas that certainly could have been improved, but this is a comfort film. Now, do you need to rush out and see this in theaters? That is up to you and your wallet. I would say if you are a huge fan of Downton Abbey, you're going to go, I'm satisfied with their ending. If you're like me, you're going to go, great, I'm satisfied enough with this ending. Please stop making them. Let it be, because I think they're out of stories to tell for these characters. Overall, I thought it was fine. I hoped for more. I got what I got. I'm going to give it a 3.7 out of 5. The last film I have this week is Spinal Tap 2, The End Continues, and much like Downton Abbey, the grand finale, this is a film where you have to have seen the original / source material in order for it to make sense. Now, it would make sense if you had not seen the film, from a plot perspective, they give you the kind of general premise of it, but from a references and callbacks and jokes and all this stuff perspective, yeah, you have to have seen This Is Spinal Tap, and I can't imagine why you wouldn't have. I have not seen This Is Spinal Tap in a very long time, I will admit that. I had a good time in it. I got to see it at a screening where it was clearly super fans, and they were having an absolute ball, which is such a relief for me, right? Because this is a film clearly made with the fans of the film in mind, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It follows the same documentary format as the first one. Did we need this film? No, not necessarily, but does it bring joy to people, and is that really important in this day and age? Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it got a seal of approval from the hardcore fans, who are the people who are going to be the ones to go see this. I certainly loved a ton of the jokes and references in it, without recalling a lot of the things from the first film. I just love the wordplay a lot of the times. There are certainly a lot of cameos in this. And then at one point, and this is a sub-hour and a half film. This is like an hour and 22-minute film. At one point, I wrote in my notes, I was like, okay, what is happening? Like, we're starting to drag a little bit. And then at the exact moment, they injected it with a big splashy plot point. I went, okay, here you go. So if you are a huge fan of this film, yeah, absolutely, go out and see it. I think it's a logical continuation. They very easily slip back into the skin of these characters. It's not got the novelty of the first one, obviously, but they had an audience in mind. If you are a soft fan of the first one, I think you could maybe wait until this comes out on home entertainment. I don't know if you need to see it in a theater. If you are unfamiliar with This is Spinal Tap, no, absolutely do not see this film because it will make no sense. Please do watch This is Spinal Tap because that is an amazing film, but I think you will know in your heart of hearts whether or not you want to go see this film, and I would say follow your gut on that one. I personally am going to give this a 3.7 out of 5. That honestly might be a little inflated, but I had a crowd who was really into it, and I think their energy helps buoy my experience. So if you are able to go see this with diehards, I think that is the way to experience it in a theater. Otherwise, you can wait for it to come out, or this might be a skip for some folks.